Sorry, I'm running a little bit late tonight. So it's just trying to make everything summer. It was fun. But in case some other kid wants to play soccer, that's a joke. Okay. No goals today about soccer. Just soccer, other stuff. But we'll go ahead and pray. Good to see y'all. I was thinking everybody's here because they want to learn about Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, and realize, well, you were having ice cream. Yeah, probably. That's all right. Yeah, that's right. Well, let's pray together. We'll get started. God, I pray you help us tonight as we look at your word. Lord, I do want to thank you for everyone that's here to sacrifice some time. Lord, just to come out and fellowship and learn some things from some of the books of the Old Testament that we may not be real familiar with. I pray you just help me to communicate effectively. I do want to thank you, Lord, for our service this morning, for the visitors we had. Lord, I pray you might just continue to work. And your word, as you say, will not return void. We thank you for it, President. Amen. All right, so we're going to start with the book of Ecclesiastes. And just so you know, I always try to leave on the table whatever we covered last week. And as you probably guessed, we only covered Proverbs last week. The week before that, we only covered Psalms. And honestly, we could be in Psalms and Proverbs for a long, long time. And as y'all see here, there's a lot of stuff on Ecclesiastes that we can do as well. And I always try to remind myself, Phil, it's a summary. You don't have to get the whole thing. But that's difficult for me to do. But anyway, so we'll dive into this book of Ecclesiastes that we're going to look at tonight. And again, just kind of give you a little bit about it. If you see the top right corner, the name of the book is called The Book About Life, or The Book About Life and Life in General. And as far as diving into this, in fact, I looked at it today. About 2 years ago, we went through on Sunday mornings a sermon series walking through the book of Ecclesiastes. We went verse by verse, and there were some kind of difficult things to walk through, and there were some things that really, it's not one of those books that you're like, hey, if I want to feel really good about myself and about life, I'm going to read Ecclesiastes, but it is straight with you. That's the thing. If you know, sometimes in life, you need that person that just tells you, to kind of puff you up, build you up a little bit. But then sometimes in life, you need that just straight, brutal honesty. Ecclesiastes is that brutal honesty with that. And so when you read the book of Ecclesiastes, again, this is this one in Song of Solomon that we're going to look at tonight, hopefully, with that is, these are the 5 middle books of the Old Testament that are called the wisdom literature. It necessarily is not historical, meaning it's not like got certain events and historical timeline. It's really just looking inwardly. And we looked at the life of Job a couple of weeks ago. Job's that one. Psalms is all over the place as far as that. We did the book of Proverbs last week. Proverbs is written, to give you an idea, Proverbs is written kind of in the middle or kind of the peak of Solomon's wisdom. Solomon is known as the wisest man to have ever lived. God gave him just an unbelievable amount of wisdom to govern, to do different things, and God helped him. And as we'll see as we get into next week, we're going to get into those major prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah. Okay, I'll be honest, Isaiah is what we'll get into next week. Someone asked me one time, you ever thought about doing a sermon series through Isaiah? And I said I would probably not be alive by the time we got to the end of it, just because it's a great book, and such a large book. In that, but so these kind of wedged in the middle of the story. The wedged in the middle of the story of creation, Moses, Joshua, Ruth, Esther, all those, and then boom, here you go, you got the wisdom literature ones. And so this is where you get Solomon. Now remember, Solomon is the son of David. And I always say this, if you ever thought about following up somebody, stepping in somebody's shoes, Solomon had to replace David, the man after God's own heart. But in a lot of ways, where David failed, Solomon exceeded and did well. And they both had some pretty common failures as well. But as far as the author of Ecclesiastes is Solomon. He actually calls himself in chapter 1, verse 1, he calls himself the son of David. And he actually calls himself the preacher. And that's kind of interpreted as preacher. And we'll explain that here in just a little bit. Again, as we look at the date of this, it's written around 935 years before Christ was even born. So, to me, just on a side note, I think it's fascinating that the Bible is always relevant. Like, the Bible doesn't have to catch up to, well, just get with the times. You know, well, my wardrobe may be like that, but, God is never that way. You know, I mean, God is things that we see in Solomon's life here as he's looking back, really, and towards the end of his life. Solomon had a seesaw life. I mean, he had a life where things were going great and then things were going bad. But we see this is really in the latter years of Solomon's life. Many people believe that really the glory years of Solomon were really starting to fade. And even Solomon, many people that I've studied think that Solomon was starting to see how the kingdom was really going to start dividing. Because you may or may not know this, when Solomon dies, his two sons decide that I want to be king. No, I want to be king. Jeroboam and Rehoboam, I want to be king. And eventually the kingdom splits. And the kingdom divides, and it never really goes back. And eventually it goes to a northern kingdom, southern kingdom. They go into captivity, both kingdoms do. They run from God. The northern kingdom never has one godly king at all. The southern kingdom of Judah, by the way, if you were coming, we finished up the series with Habakkuk. Really, Habakkuk was talking about the southern kingdom of Judah, how they do a little bit for God, but then turn away. And so Solomon, a lot of people believe Solomon's getting to that point where it's almost like he can see it coming. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but when there's a certain part of the passage where Solomon basically says this, and I'm paraphrasing, put it in Phil language. He says, life is meaningless if I've saved all this up, done all this, and I'm going to give it to my feuding idiot sons that are going to destroy everything. And it's basically what he says. He says, my sons don't care about anything but themselves, and they're going to destroy each other just to get what Daddy built up for them. And that's really a sad story. Maybe you've seen that in your life, but that's kind of where the idea of the day is. That. Well, the occasion of it or the purpose of it, the word Ecclesiastes means one who addresses an assembly. So that's where you get the word preacher from, one who addresses an assembly. So that's what we take the name there of Ecclesiastes. In fact, when we talk about doctrines of the Bible, talk about the doctrine of sin, talk about the doctrine of Christ. We call it like Christology, is like the doctrine of Christ. Bibliology is the doctrine of the Bible. Well, they call it ecclesiology. That's the doctrine of the church. Like, what should the church be? What is God's intention with the church? So anyways, that's what Ecclesiastes means. Ecclesiastes, just as an occasion or purpose here for you, is this. It's really a divine or God expression of failure. I mean, really, the book of Ecclesiastes talks about failure. I mean, there's a whole lot I want to do here. I mean, I was kind of this afternoon listening to little bits of our series with Ecclesiastes, and I encourage you, not me, there's probably guys that have preached a lot better than I have to the book of Ecclesiastes, but you ought to go back and listen to some of them. One of my favorite ones is chapter 7. We did 2 sermons on that. Remember, we just called it Coffee with Solomon. Kind of like if you had a grandpa that could sit you down and just kind of bestow some wisdom, like, hey, it's really Solomon telling his son, hey, before I go, here's what life's all about. And really, chapter 7 is a great one. I wasn't going to call it Coffee with Granddaddy, but I think Coffee with Solomon just rolled off my tongue with that. But it really has some great things there with that. It's a good book to really dive into. So, where Ecclesiastes is really God's expression of failure of mankind. He writes Proverbs, right? He writes the Proverbs, and Proverbs all tells us how to succeed in life. What does it say? Blessed is the man who fears in God. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not on thine understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. I mean, all those things said, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. All of Proverbs is Solomon kind of at the peak of his wisdom and glory, saying, this is how you succeed. When you get to Ecclesiastes, it's really probably about 20 years later, where Solomon's saying, hey, this is where I failed. I chased things I didn't need to chase. And we'll go through some of these here in a little bit, but I get ahead of myself a little bit. But the idea of this, it really records man's futility as a result of trying to find happiness and success and joy apart from God. So it's kind of similar to what we talked about today. And isn't that wonderful, Glenn, how the Bible, you can see in Galatians all the way back to Ecclesiastes, which is probably 1,000 years apart, how God still has this idea, Paul and Solomon. Hey, we're chasing anything for our joy but God, but Christ. Really, it's just futility. It's futile to do that. And so I always find it interesting how God does that in that. I get to the outline here. That is about the simplest outline I can do. I know some of you are like, Phil, that's a lot of depth, but I'm telling you, I went through about 5 copies to try to knock it down to that. But in the outline of the book is really the problem declared. in it. So you read, like if you got a Bible and you want to look there, like look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1. Okay? Does somebody mind reading verses 1 through 3? This is the first 3 verses of Ecclesiastes. Brother, thank you.
The words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he hath taken under the sun?
Thank you. So, right off the bat, he just sets the tone. Here's the problem. He's saying, by the way, you see the phrase, under the sun. I think if I wrote it down, he actually has, under the sun is mentioned 29 times. The example of that, what that means is life on earth without God. So he's saying, when he says, what profit a man of all his labor under the sun, meaning this, what does it profit us if we do all this life apart from God? And he mentions that 29 times. And this idea of vanity means emptiness or vapor. It's the idea of chasing the wind. It's this idea that you can feel it, you can sense it, you want it, but you never can catch it. You never can catch it, right? I remember as a kid, any of the rest of y'all grow up just very affluent like me, so when the lightning bugs came out, you caught lightning bugs and put them in a jar. And Mama would hate it every time it rained because I would not keep the same jar. I would get a different jar, a different lid, and I'd stab holes in that lid. She's like, boss, you're going to have to pick you a new lid because you're stabbing all my lids. But anyways, that's probably a little trauma coming back. But anyhow, we go do that. We grab them. Grab them, we hold them in our hand, we can see it. Solomon's saying, if what you're chasing in life is fame, relationships, wealth, anything in this life apart from God, it's like trying to catch the wind. It's vanity of vanities. It's basically meaning this, and understand here, I don't want to, you should really understand it. He's saying life is meaningless apart from God. Because you live your life, you have some years, maybe they're good, maybe they're not so good, and apart from God, you die, you go back to the dust, and if that's it, apart from God, he's saying life is pretty pointless apart from God. And so that's what he's talking about. That's the problem that he's saying, is that all of life, and he's saying, is vanity apart from that. And he goes into this like the monotony of life, and he does this in the first 2 chapters, the monotony of life, the vanity of wisdom. He's like, who cares if you know all this stuff, but you don't put it into practice, right? If you don't put into practice what you know. The futility of wealth, and I always love talking about this. So Solomon decided that he wanted to see, in like the first 2 chapters, I'm going to see what I can do, because Solomon was the wealthiest dude on the planet. Okay, by far. Many people said, in reading, there's not been a person as wealthy ever in the history of the world, per capita, even today, as Solomon. Like, the Queen of Sheba, you know, you joke about that when your kid dresses up. Like, there was a Queen of Sheba. Okay, she came, saw Solomon, all his wealth. She said, the half has not been told of all that you have. I mean, Solomon, so he had like 300 wives, 700 concubines. He had so much money, he built all 300 of his wives a house. Like a house. Not like, I'm going to add on a deck on the back. He built them all a house. Okay? Solomon, like I go out and like I want to do a little garden, I want to hang some ferns. Some of y'all are like, I'm not real big. I got plants, but I kill them. I don't know how good you are with plants or better. Some of you are like, man, you're go-getters, you got gardens, you're just stuff. Solomon planted forest, plural, like Yosemite is what he did. Like the cedars of Lebanon, that's a Solomon. Like Solomon planted forest that he could have. And Solomon even found in his wealth that even that wasn't enough. So Solomon actually did 100 days of a constant drunken party. For 100 days, Solomon killed 100 bulls to feed everyone that wants to come. 100 bulls, 100 each day, for 100 days. The biggest tailgate party you could think of. Had all the musicians. I mean, he didn't use YouTube, and that way he went and got the band, brought the band in. You work for me now, sing. That's what you do. I mean, so he did everything for like 100 days, 100 parties. And at the end of it, he said, it got kind of bored. He got kind of bored. And I know some of us that maybe have been in that life to a degree. At the beginning, there's the excitement, but after you do it for a while, it's like it just doesn't have that same luster. to do that. And Solomon said, I'm going to do everything that I can find under the sun to give me pleasure apart from God. And he was honest about it. And God said, great, we're going to write a book about it. And so he comes back and said, it's all vanity of that. So what was the conclusion? And by the way, each section has a simple conclusion. And the conclusion of it was this: enjoy and be content with what you have in life. And the verse for that section is chapter 2, verse 24. When the idea is just, hey, so what do you do with the monotony of life? I mean, you talk about the monotony of life. Anybody else excited about Monday? All right, no, excited about Monday? All right, it's a Monday, right? I actually practice that. If I'm in town and I see people and I see anyone, because I try to every now and then get someone to smile, occasionally, depends on my mood, and I see them, I say, how you doing? Is it a Monday? And they're like, hey, you have no idea. And I'm like, I don't, thank you for my coffee. Keep going. No, I mean, something like that. But you know what I mean? You ask people, is it a Monday? Some people say it's a Monday on a Thursday, right? This idea of the monotony of life. You work, you eat, you sleep, you go back. You work, you eat, sleep, you go to church, something, you go back. All these different things you do, the monotony of life. And he said, what's the conclusion? Enjoy what God's given you and be content with it, because it won't last. It really won't last in those things. I mean, Solomon, God even helps him in one of the passages saying, hey, you know what? There's nothing wrong with enjoying a good meal, some good food, and friends. So you want to help yourself in the monotony and just, I feel like I'm in a rut in life. He says, have a meal, have some friends, have some good food, and enjoy life. Those are the blessings of God. That's what it is. So some of us think if we have a meal and friends, is this really okay? Am I spending money? Whatever it may be. The Bible says that God says everything that he's given under the sun has been given for our enjoyment. It's been given for our enjoyment. So for your enjoyment, it might be some fried chicken. I don't know why. It might be fried chicken. For me, man, if I get a good filet, a good steak, dude, that is awesome. I know for Rachel, it's like Reese cups and a chilled with crushed ice, like Sonic crushed ice, Diet Dr. Pepper. That will really make her life well. I learned that early in life, and that has helped me a lot of times in life to do those things. Whatever it is you like, right? And here's what you need to understand. What he's saying is to understand when you get stuck in the futility of life, the monotony of life, is enjoy and be content with what God's given you, because it doesn't last. He basically says it like this: everyone in this room is one day closer to eternity than they were yesterday. We are. And that can be a very depressing thing, but it also can be a very joyful thing to enjoy what God's given. Enjoy what God's given. So you see the problem declared, man. Life is means part of God. The problem discussed, and what he tells them in chapters 3 through 10 are really about this. He says, Solomon, what you got to do is you got to quit focusing on yourself and your happiness and look up, because happiness, joy comes from God. Joy, true joy comes from God, to look up. And then he does tell him to look within, because sometimes the problem isn't everyone else. Even though we think the problem is everyone else. If everyone else did what they're supposed to do, life would be great. But son, he says, look inwardly. He says, make sure everything's right on the inside before you go on. And then he says, look ahead. And that idea of looking ahead is that you need to look ahead to the blessings and the joy that God will give us in the future. Don't get me wrong, I'm not looking to go to heaven in the next load, so to speak. But it does give me some joy to know one day all the pain, all the suffering, all the frustration in life will be over, and spend eternity with the one that created me, saved me, loved me, sustained me, carried me, dealt with me. I'll be with it. That's got to give you some joy, in that. And then it's the idea of look around at how God has blessed you. I don't know about you, but there's times in my life where I get so busy and so my head down, nose to the grindstone, we get seasons of life. But we get so much in that we never stop and just really enjoy the moments we have. I thought about it like this. So we started this soccer season, and it's been, if I did my math right, this has been like the 26th year I've ever headed up a sport between where I was back home and here. And I remember starting it before I had kids, and now have kids. Well, now I have one kid that's aged out. We really didn't think a 20-year-old that was married and could still be playing soccer. So anyway, we were just aged out, right? I mean, Isaac had signed the permission form, but I mean, to play. But if I think about it, Noah's, I told him, Noah, I think, man, this is it, man. This is your year. Like the soccer, the basketball, the stuff that you're going to do. I mean, this is it, man. And many of you in this room, you remember the glory days. you were awesome in high school. A lot of us remember that. I had something really funny I was going to say. I'll go ahead and tell you this. So some of us remember those glory days, but they go by so fast, man. They go by fast. I'm really, in one sense, kind of terrified in one sense that here in about 6 weeks, I won't have a child at home anymore. I'll have all teenagers or older. Chloe will be 13. I mean, wow. You know, that way you're like, Phil, I need to cry in my ice cream. I don't want you to cry in your ice cream, okay? But what I'm trying to get us to understand is what he's saying here in all these things is that you need to look up, look within, look ahead, look around, and look what he comes back to even there again, the conclusion. Enjoy life. Enjoy life. There's nothing wrong. The Bible isn't God's will for you as a Christian is not to be miserable and broken. That's not it. But it's also not to be the wealthiest person in the world either, so don't jump to the other end. But whatever God gives you in life, the idea is to enjoy life with what you have. And then the third point is that the problem decided, like, well, how do we do it then? If life is meaningless in the sense apart from God, how is the problem decided? Well, he says in chapters 11 and 12, really great chapters, I don't want to say, but we're going to keep going, is the idea is I just put it down like this: live by faith. If you could kind of sum up life. I mean, some days you're like, what do I got to do in the Christian life? I got to do this and this and this and this and these other 47 things. Live a life of faith. Enjoy the life God's given you now. And beware of foolishness. And you say, what's foolishness? I think we all know. And that may come in different shapes, in different forms, in different times, in different seasons. Beware of foolishness. Beware of the things that pull you away from God. You've heard me say it before, it's not original to me. Always be aware of what robs your affections for Jesus. You know, stir those things and stir your affection for Jesus. And when you find things in life that rob or numb those affections for Jesus, get away from them. Get away from them because they'll hurt you in life. And then, again, the conclusion in chapter 12, verses 9 through 14, it says, what? Be content and enjoy. Be content and enjoy in that. So, obviously, didn't have a big enough board to do all that, but we are, before we jump over there, I do want to go over these key verses with us. And, again, a lot of verses. I was proud of myself to narrow it down this far. That's Brian, I'm sorry. But if somebody mind reading chapter 2, verse 11 and verse 14.
Then I looked on all the work that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. And verse 14. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness, and I myself perceived also that one event happeneth to them all.
So, I mean, that's a lot of wrapped up in just 2 verses right there, right? I mean, he's talking about this, there's no profit under the sun, and he's basically said, you know, if you can just kind of reduce it all, he says there's no profit under the sun apart from God and what you do. And then the verse 14 he read, which he talked about, a wise person has the eyes in the head. He said, what do you mean by that? It just means their eyes are open, they beware of foolishness. They see it coming in that. And I kind of look like, I don't like seeing people get hurt, but have you ever watched these little videos of people that are down, their heads are down on their cell phones and they don't see and they like walk into things and do it? I think it's hilarious. But it's going to happen to me. Like this one poor dude had his head down, he walked right into a sign. I just thought it was the funniest thing. I laughed several times within it, friends. But anyhow, you know, this whole idea is that what's wrong with them? They got eyes, but they're not using them, right? Heads down in that thing. And so he says, you know, the fool walks in darkness, but the man that has wisdom is that. And here's what he said at the end of verse 14, and you get this, and again, not to sound so grim with everything. He said, but whether you're the richest person or the poorest person, you're the wisest person or the foolish person, he said there's one event that happens to all of us. What's that? Death. Every one of us. Appointed unto man wants to die after this judgment. He's saying, so the rich, even Solomon is saying, no matter how much wealth I have, I can't escape this one event. This one event. All right, so let's keep going here. Does somebody mind? Now, chapter 3 is a chapter that you probably know. Listen to the Beatles growing up. You're going to really recognize part of this. But anyway, somebody mind reading those verses? Chapter 3, verse 1 through 8. Thanks, Joel.
For everything there is a season and time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted. time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace.
Wow, that's a lot. I mean, you probably recognize that. Some of y'all probably sang the song. But anyhow, but this idea, and I have underlined my notes, that everything, the very first verse, that everything that happens in life, there's a season. That's a good reminder, right? But sometimes when things happen in life, we're like, man, this is never going to end. But to everything, there's a season, right? There's a season for that. And then verse 11, Joel, you mind reading that? I'm sorry, I meant to do that too.
He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart. Yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end.
Thank you. So in the midst of everything that goes on in life, he says in verse 11, but God makes all things beautiful in his time. We sing this little chorus, it's in our songbook. In his time, he makes all things beautiful in his time. Lord, please show me every day as I'm seeking you, Lord, seeking your way, that you'll do just what you say in your time. That God has allowed everything that happens in your life, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it, he's making all things beautiful. So if God takes everything that happens in my life, and there's a purpose for it, and that's what he's saying in verse number 11. He's going to take everything in my life that happens, and he's going to make it beautiful in his time. That sounds a whole lot like what verse in Romans 8? Romans 8:28, right? And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. You know, a lot of times we look in the New Testament, but man, that Paul dude, man, where he just pulled this stuff from was great. Paul was very knowledgeable of the Old Testament. So Paul, I'm just going to guess, may have had a little bit of Ecclesiastes and Solomon's wisdom put in his head, saying, you know what, God does do everything in his time. He makes everything beautiful. And the idea there with that verse is kind of an illustration I saw one time, is that if you ask me if I want some raw eggs or some flour or some salt or some baking soda, you can keep that. But you mix all that together with like some cake mix and stuff, and you put it in the oven, you heat it up. I want to help you take that cake down. But it's saying that all that stuff has to go together in the pot. It all has to be mixed up together. And then it has to be exposed to heat for an extended period of time before it can come forth and really be the enjoyment that it wants to be. It's really that picture of a cake with that. So anyhow, so just great verses there with that. We'll keep moving. Chapter 4. Somebody mind reading verse 9 and 10?
Okay. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up.
Thank you. So to me, that's all about community and friendship, right? We gotta have community and friendship. That's why you hear me just harp from the pulpit that is, as a church, what we have to do, we have to be a community of faith. It can't just be something you pop into and pop out. And there may be seasons of life you have to do that. But here's the deal, is that everyone in this room has went through things, and some of us have went through things in this room. And I thank God I've had my brothers and sisters in Christ to help me to be there for them. You know, two walk together, because if one stumbles, the other one's there to help them up, right? And the idea is, like, some of us in this room, we could probably take testimonies tonight. We won't take time for it. We could go through this and say, you know what, we went through some hard times. I went through some times, and even though I didn't want to express my feelings and what happened, thank God I had so-and-so or so-and-so there for me to help me through that time, to help me up. Because what does he say? He says, woe, beware to that person that just tries to do all this on their own. But that's the tendency, right? That's the tendency. Because relationships are messy. People are messy. And sometimes people break trust and those different things. And he says, woe when you don't have it. But when God gives you friends, gives you those good godly friends that you have, man, that's great. You know, when God blesses you in that way, it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing with that. We'll skip ahead. We don't mind looking at chapter 9. And somebody mind reading verse 10?
For there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave whither thou goest.
Thank you. That's a lot better than Habakkuk. Look, Matt, by the way, you did a great job. Yeah, you did a great job. I'll tell you, thank you. Matt does a great job reading scripture doing that. But I like what it says here. Whatsoever thy hand finds to do, do it with thy mind. Give 100%. And that's something we try to teach even our kids, right? Even if you don't agree with it, even if you don't understand it, no matter what it is, do it with all of your might, do it with all your ability, why you can do it. Why? Don't do it halfway. Because he said there's nothing that when you're gone, nothing that be done. When you're gone, we're gone in that. So, anyhow. And then chapter 12, these are the last two verses of the book. There is a lot more that you could say about this. I mean, really, chapter 12 is just a great thing about remember now that thy creator in the days of thy youth in chapter 12, verse 1. But does somebody mind read those last two verses, 13 and 14?
I got
Thanks.
it. Oh, yeah, good.
Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil.
Thank you. So, I mean, I like how Solomon finally says, all right, at the end, let me just give you the conclusion about this whole thing, about life. And it's like what you read there, Ms. Tina. The idea is this, is that we need to fear God and keep his commandments. That sounds a whole lot like his word in Proverbs, right? Sounds a lot like his Proverbs coming back to me there. And he gives the reality, God's going to bring every work into judgment. Everything, whether we think it's secret or not secret in that. So, just a lot of good things there. And then to shift over on the part about main characters, and I'm just going to put this down for main characters. At first glance, you would think it would just be Solomon. But really, after it does, it's not really Solomon, it's about life. Really, the main character about this is really about life itself and its emptiness apart from God. And again, I think that's one great thing when we get together at times that we share what God has done in our lives. We don't have to like gratify sin, give glory to sin, but just really the idea that life itself is empty apart from God. It's just meaningless apart from God. Doesn't mean you can't have some joy, can't have some happiness, can't have some things, but it's just the idea that happens with that. And then the special features, it just really gives a lot of things about that monotony and stuff that I was talking about earlier, like the repetition, cycle of repetition in life that you read about, a time to weep, a time to mourn, those things that Joel read about there. And then really chapter 4 is just a great chapter on, hey, bad things happen to good people. Now, why is it that a person that's ungodly, defies God, will live to be a ripe old age, but then you hear about people that are of faith or children or something like die? Like, why is that fair? Well, remember, in reality, God never claimed to be fair. God always claims to be just. And that's different. Fair is a human opinion. As one deep Bible scholar told me one time. He says, fair is where a pig wins a ribbon, is really what it is. That's what fair is. And I was like, well, I'm not that deep, but anyhow. But then it talks about how to deal with frustration. I mean, there's a lot of frustration in life. It talks about uncertainty of life, just how life is uncertain about things. And we talk about it all the time. If your life is all built on happiness, every one of us, our happiness can be robbed from us in just a phone call or a text. We're not talking about a devastating thing. We could just be something that frustrates us, throws us off. Just a funny example, right before, about 10 minutes before this class started, I got a text from somebody about something they weren't happy with. So with soccer, now I got to take care of that, but I had to stop for a moment and say, I'm not going to let that consume me right now. I'm going to focus on what I got to do, and I'll deal with that later in the other 299 meetings with that, right? and then the idea of what's unfair and unjust. And then we put this part, life that's blessed by God, and that's really chapter 12. Remember now thy creator in the days of thy youth. Now let me just express it like this. Some of you in this, how many in this room, like, you were born and like you were immediately into the church nursery, like you grew up in church, like pretty much from day one, like your first word was Jesus. Okay, good. All right, you're good. You're born, preacher spanks you. That's the way we were. How many of you, God and relationship with God was later in life? Okay. Yeah, like that. And the idea of what's being said here is that for us, it's okay if you didn't grow up in church like that. It's okay if you come to faith in God later. But chapter 12 is this great reminder. Man, he's telling his kids, remember now, God. Focus on God now. Don't wait till you're later. Don't sow the wild oats, so to speak. I mean, every one of us, I think, to a degree, has things that we regret. That if I could go back in time and tell my 20-year-old self, or 30-year-old self, or 18-year-old self, I would have a pretty strong conversation with him about some things. And that's what chapter 12 is about. Yeah, I'm strangling. You know, that is that the idea is that, you know, when you think about life, remember God now. Yeah, remember him now with that. And then talking about life blessed by God is that wisdom can be learned at whatever age we're at. Is that you have a purpose regardless of where you're at in life. So whether you are young in the faith, whether you have lots of abilities you feel like God's given you or just a few abilities, if you're older, if you're younger, you're somewhere in between, if you're full, like your plate is just overflowing or you feel like there's nothing to do, it's just a boring life. Every one of us has a purpose. God has a purpose for every one of us in that. And then also just to fear God and keep his commandments with that. And then I just wrote this down as far as a picture of Christ. You will not see in this book, which is kind of a common theme in the Gospels and the entire Old Testament, thus saith the Lord. Thus saith the Lord. You don't read that one time in Ecclesiastes. Thus saith the Lord. But instead, I still think through this book, Solomon, through God's intervention, teaches us a few things. He teaches us about God's existence, about God's sovereignty, God's power, God's justice, but also teaches us about man's sinfulness. I mean, you think about everything that Solomon, everything you've done in your life, maybe the foolish things you've done in your life. Can you imagine writing a book about that and publishing it for everyone to read? That's what God asked Solomon to do. He says, Solomon, all the foolishness that you've done, I want you to stamp your name on it. I want you printed, and it's going to go around the world for emperor. And people are going to learn from your foolishness. I mean, I don't want to sign up for that gig, right? But that's what Solomon did, right? And just to help us understand the idea of man's sinfulness with that. And that is a very fast version of Ecclesiastes with that. Does anybody have any thoughts about the book? Anything like that that you can think of or comments? If you don't, it's okay. Anybody wants to go through another sermon series on Ecclesiastes? We want some happy, right? That way. So we are going to do a happy book next time. But anyhow, just quickly, because we won't spend as much time there, we're going to look at the next book, the Song of Solomon. Which I normally don't say this. But as you're turning there to the Song of Solomon, just if you want to pray about it, sometimes people ask these questions. I'm not a celebrity, I'm getting a picture. No, I'm kidding. Rodney King, look at my good side. No, I'm kidding. And some people were asking, and so I don't really like to say a lot of times what we're going to be looking at, but just because I feel like if God changes, I don't pick it up. But we are going through, like we said, the book of Galatians. And I really feel led that really God's helped me in one thing, maybe almost over the next year, where we're going to be at on Sunday morning. So we're going to be in Galatians for a while. After we get through Galatians, we're going to go to the book of Philippians. And it's really a book about joy in the midst of life and how to have joy. And then probably first of the year, we are going to dive into the book of Hebrews. And I'm really excited about that. There's a lot in Hebrews that we can see and understand a lot about. There's a greater than Moses that's here. You know, there is, and maybe if you want to read some of the different books, I'm just letting you know. You say, Phil, what are you doing on Wednesday nights? We are going to make it through these disciples. And then after that, I'm not 100% sure, but I feel like we're going to do a character study. We're going to look at the life of Moses and just walk through Moses' life from being born, the baby in the basket, all the way until the Bible says God buries him. And there's a lot about Moses' life, a lot of times we skip over with that. So that's probably what it's going to be. So I'm just telling you in case you want to know what months you want to skip church with that. All right? So anyhow, so Song of Solomon. And again, these books are not written, they're not compiled in chronological order, right? Because if it was, Song of Solomon would be way in front of Ecclesiastes. And so again, if you're with us tonight, you know, it's not every week we focus a lot on Solomon, but this is Solomon. So this book, it's kind of funny. I was going to ask this. So how many of you have read Song of Solomon all the way through, and not because it was part of your Bible reading schedule, but just, I think I'm going to read the Song of Solomon. Oh, really? Cool. Cool. Most people are like, all right, is that part of the reading chart? So I'm going to get through Song of Solomon and go, yeah. Right. It's not a book that people run too much, all right? I don't know if I've ever met anyone that says, my life verse. Song of Solomon. With that. But anyway, it's written by Solomon. He's very young in his time when he writes this book. It's around 965 BC. And if that helps you, just to give you kind of an idea about that, there's about a 30-year difference between Song of Solomon when he wrote that. 30 years later, he writes Ecclesiastes. 30 years. So that's a good chunk. I've been married for 24 years. So, I mean, it's a lot different stage of life than where Solomon is at. And so this book has been called several things. It's been called the Song of Solomon. It's been called the Song of Songs. You may have heard of it like that. But again, it's written in 965 BC by a very young Solomon with that. And what's the occasion of it? If you remember last week, I talked about Proverbs, how Solomon had written all of these Proverbs, but he also wrote 1,005 songs. Like these songs, these poems, like this is a song. Now remember, Jewish culture, they don't have the rhyme and stuff. They don't have to rhyme. Like with us, they have to rhyme, like it doesn't make sense. You know, if it doesn't rhyme. This whole story is one song that he wrote, of 1,005 songs that he wrote. And really, it's about Solomon's courtship and the wedding to his bride. It's a Shulamite bride. She's a princess. And so he marries her. It's just, you say he had 300 wives. Yeah, I get that. He had all these wives that he has. But the understanding of it is this, is that many, and this is a little philology, okay? I really believe, looking back on this, even though Solomon went down the wrong road immorally, I think the reason we have this book of the Bible is because this was Solomon and his pure, honest love that he had. Like, it wasn't just another wife, another thing that it endured or go through as far as immorality and those kind of things. I really feel like there's a special purpose for this book, and it's just the occasion of it as far as why it was written. A lot of people think this is just an allegory. It's just really to illustrate something. I will tell you this, and you may see it at the top where it says Book of Union and Communion. Really, and I say it later, really the Song of Solomon, what it is meant to do, it's a picture of us as believers with God. That's what it is. It's a picture of you and me with God is really what it is. That communion, that union that we have with Christ. And he wrote it, of course, to his bride. So for the outline of the book, I really condensed this, is in three parts. Really, their courtship. I think Spurgeon had said the first 3 chapters is his wooing. This is him trying to win her love, win her affection. Kind of like me and the Diet Dr. Pepper on fresh dice with, Reese Cups, but Solomon did a little better job than I did. With that, so it's the idea of him wooing her, the courtship, how they long for each other, all those things. And then chapter 3, verse 6 through the beginning of chapter 5 is about their wedding, the wedding that they have. And remember, Solomon's as wealthy and as big as the other men, what that thing looked like. As far as that wedding and the things that part of the wedding ceremony. And then the last part of the book is about the marriage, which everyone in this room that's married, that's 3 interesting points, right? These are 3, someone told me one time, that's all the same. Oh, no, it's not. You've never been married. There's a difference between the dating, the courtship, the wedding, and then actually what marriage and life is together. Those are 3 very different things, in that. And so that's kind of the outline of the book with that. There's a lot to be seen about that and talk about that. I mean, he repeatedly says that she is fair and that he will run after her. He longs for her, and it's really beautiful in a lot of the ways that you see it there as far as his heart. It's really his love expressed to her in this book. It's just really interesting back and forth as they talk to each other. And I believe, if I didn't mess up on this, when you read the book, it has communication back and forth, things that she says to Solomon, things Solomon says to her. When Solomon ever speaks to her, he calls her my love. And whenever she speaks to him, it's called my beloved. So that kind of may help you a little bit if you're reading, wondering who's speaking to who when they do that. So anyways, key verses for it. And I know some of y'all are scared to death to read verses in Song of Solomon, and it's okay with that. But does somebody mind reading? I'm not setting you up to fail. Chapter 2, verse 4. Thanks for that.
He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love.
So this is her speaking, and she's just kind of remembering that, he brought her in, like to the banqueting house, to the wine house, to the place of celebration. And he said basically that his banner over her is love. I don't know if you've ever heard, there's an old hymn that talks about Jesus is a rock of our salvation, his banner over me is love. Maybe you've never heard that song. I've heard it growing up. We actually did little things like, y'all remember that? It was me. There you go, you forgot it, good. Your kids are learning that, that's Gabriel info for the next couple weeks. So anyhow, but this idea is that it's just that it wasn't just love. It wasn't just love mentioned, it was love shown, love expressed. Like, it's almost like everywhere she walked. The idea is this, that everywhere I walked, Solomon's love in me was so evident. It's as if somebody was holding a banner over me saying, loved by Solomon. I'm loved by Solomon. I mean, that's how much she felt loved. That's how much he loved her. And really, and a lot of us guys like, can we skip to something else, please? But anyhow, this idea. Happy birthday. Anyway, we'll keep going. So it's kind of that mentality. And then chapter 6, verse number 3. Somebody mind reading it? Elizabeth?
I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He feedeth among the lilies.
So you might ask yourself, why is that a key verse? I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine. What he's saying here, and again, Solomon later totally turns to just gross immorality. We get that. But what he's saying is this. She's saying, I am his, and I am his one and only, and he is mine, my one and only. And by the way, what a picture of God. See, because when you think about it, it's this. God loves you as if you are the only person on earth that needed to be saved. As if you were an only child. Like, anybody here an only child? Okay, you feel? He says it right next to his sister. Yep, right here. Oh my God. So, how many of you grew up with like a lot of siblings? Like a lot, okay? So, sometimes you always felt like you had to fight, you had to compete for attention or maybe affection, and I've always heard people say this too, is that sometimes kids will even act out sometimes, you know why? Because any attention is better than no attention at all. And I'm thinking, who came up with that idea? But it is true. Okay, I got kids to show for Grayson. To show for that, okay? So all that stuff happens, it's true. But the idea of what they're saying here is, he goes, I'm hers. She's mine, and it's just us. And it's that same mentality with God. Is that even though God has a great big family, the idea is that he still treats me as if it's just us. It's just us. And it's really just a good picture of that. And then chapter 7, verse number 10.
I got it.
Thank you.
I am my beloved, and his desire is toward me.
Okay? So again, this idea is talking about how faithful it is, his desire. She's like, I am his, and his desire is towards me. That means his focus is totally on me. Again, what a wonderful picture of God, that God's desire is for us. God desires us, God wants us, God wants a close relationship. I said it like this before, and I think hopefully you understand what I mean by this. You and I have the relationship with God that you want. You have the relationship with God that you want. No, I want a better relationship with God. He longs and desires us. Draw nigh to God, James says, and he will draw nigh to you. And the understanding here, what Song of Solomon is saying, she's saying this, she's like Bride saying this, she's saying, I am his desire. He desires to be close to me, intimate with me, that relationship with me. And he says he wants that with me, and I want that with him. And again, it's a wonderful picture about us in that. And so I try to remind myself of that that sometimes, man, I just feel far from God. Then I have to ask myself, well, who moved if I feel far from God in that? And so main characters of the book is, of course, Solomon and Shulamite bride. Just two characters for that. And then special features. It's really an Old Testament comparison of Ephesians chapter 5. And I'm going to flip there real quick. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 32. So when you get to Ephesians chapter 5, Ephesians 5 is a great chapter about walking in love. It's this idea of walk as children of light. Verse 15 says, see that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time. Walk around the situation, be smart in that. It talks about what being filled with the Spirit of God, talking about giving thanks, submitting yourselves one to another. Of course, when you get to the end of chapter 5, it talks about what? You submit yourselves one to another. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wife, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And this goes on and on and on about that, which even verse 27, that comment to the men to love the wives. And a lot of times wives, you might hate that one word. God gave you one verse, he gave the guys like 4 verses because he knows we're thick and we're dense. And so he's like, here's why you want to love your wife the way Christ loved the church. Verse 27 says, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own body. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. So I mean, it's pretty fascinating if you really think about what that means. And I know I've said it before, if you ever want just a good refresher book on marriage, there's lots of them I can recommend. And I recommend this guy a lot in this particular book. But I don't think you find a better book about your mentality towards your spouse in marriage than You and Me Forever by Francis Chan. I don't think you beat it. And the reason, Francis and Lisa Chan, because the whole mentality of that book is this: what am I doing for the day that Rachel stands before God? Because that's a lot better. It's even better than her getting a Diet Dr. Pepper with a Reese cup right now. That's still involved. But what am I doing in the years that God's given me to help her for the day she stands before God? Because God's given me to help her in this life, and God's given me to her, pray for her, to help me for the day I stand before God. In that, and it's really what it means with that. And then verse 32 is the verse that we said the comparison is this. He says, this is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. So all the Song of Solomon is the mystery put on display of what Christ and the church is. And it's really the picture of us with Christ as our union together in that. That's what it is. And that is put down pictures and prophecies of Christ. In the Old Testament, Israel is always viewed as the bride of Christ, the bride of Yahweh, right? And by the way, you say, I don't really see that. There's a book called Hosea. In the book of Hosea, it's 100% about God and his bride, and his bride is Israel, and how they turned and went away to other things in life. And so that's what the whole book of Hosea is about. I'm looking forward to talking about that in the weeks to come. But the Old Testament, Israel is viewed as the bride, but in the New Testament, the church, not Emmanuel Baptist Church, but us as believers throughout the world, right? We are the bride of Christ, right? That's how we're viewed. And really, ultimately, and that's kind of compiled like this, is really the book. It really expresses really the innermost feelings that God has for his people, his love that he has for his people. So I'll read you this little quote by, I thought his name was funny. It doesn't give his last name. It's an old saint. His actual name is Bernard, so St. Bernard, and I thought that was funny. But anyway, talking about this book, he says, this is the Song of Songs. This is the first of all the rest. It talks about grace alone and experience alone can learn the grace of God. Without a spiritual mind, it is impossible to enter into this book and what this book illustrates with a union and communion without having a relationship with Christ, because Christ is the bridegroom and the church is his bride. He just said you really can't understand what this book means without the idea of that. But anyhow, that was way too much for me to write down going forward. But anyhow, so maybe you learned a little something about Song of Solomon tonight, right? Everybody's ready for some light training. Anybody got any questions, comments? I'm scared to ask questions about Song of Solomon. But anyone got any questions or anything like that? All right. I really do appreciate you being here tonight. We're gonna pray, and then I know we're gonna get some ice cream, hopefully hang around fellowship and things like that. And next week, we'll jump into Isaiah. I'm excited about that. Isaiah's just got a lot of things. Isaiah is known as the Little Bible. It's 66 chapters, and I'm excited about that. Let's pray. God, thank you for this day. Thank you for the time again we have together. Lord, as we fellowship here in a little bit with this ice cream, I pray you just might just bless the time together, the food together, Lord, and just our conversation, our mealtime, may it please you. And Lord, I do thank you for these books. What a tremendous difference between Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. But God, you have such a divine purpose in both of them for our lives. And Lord, I pray you would help us to remember that life apart from you really is meaningless. But it's only because of your unbelievable love that you have for us and relationship and closeness you desire for us to have together. Thank you for all you do. Lord, be with these people as they go about their week, or from their families, from their job, from their children, from their activities, all that they do. Please keep them safe. Lord, please, not just physically, but spiritually. Lord, thank you for all you do in Christ. Amen.